So I'm Susan Robertson. We have a family farm here in the southern Riverina. We're a mixed sheep cropping property, so we've got Merino ewes, a self-replacing flock, about 1,500 ewes usually, with a proportion of those joined to a white Suffolk ram for lamb production, and your typical range of crops for this sort of region, so wheat, canola, lupins, barley, and oats, which are grazed by the sheep sometimes. So I've only had Angoras for 2 years. So I bought these in May 22. Why? Because I'm primarily a wool person. I really love fibre, and goats are obviously have an excellent fibre in mohair. So I thought, well, maybe why not? But that was on the basis that it's probably as profitable as sheep production, wool production. And I had goats, or two pet goats when I was younger, so I was familiar with them. And then I had a student a few years ago who had Angoras, about 100 does, and so we did a research project on those. So I was interested in them then, and then I did a little bit more research around the profitability of them to see whether it's actually worth doing it. And I figured, it's worth a shot. So mohair has long term been more profitable than wool. So it goes up and down as wool has, but at the moment mohair is receiving record prices. So a young goat, fine young goat like that might get something close to $40. Kid might be more than that, depending on what the market's doing. There's only 2 sales per year, so there's a long break in between sales. So those prices are way above what wool is. So 19 micron wool. Fleece wool would be worth somewhere around $14 a kilo at the moment. So providing that they cut enough wool or equivalent sort of levels of wool and mohair in a year, and your costs are not excessive, they're likely to be more profitable or as profitable. I haven't done a proper average, but I do know my 18-month-old animals were cutting close to 3 kilos. Average 3 kilos. So a bit of range between 2 and 3.7, I think, was the top weight there, but average 3. Shearers for goats are absolutely harder to find because there's not many Angora goats around, so there's not many people who have actually shorn Angora goats. So I just use the same shearers I use for shearing sheep. But yes, I would certainly recommend finding a shearer who's prepared to shear them if you're just going into goats and don't have a shearer sort of lined up. They will charge more, most likely, than they would charge for the sheep, and your regular shearers may not shear them. Finding shearers is an issue, as it is with sheep, but it's not impossible. They're very similar to manage to the sheep. All the same sort of operations. Shearing, crutching, drenching, vaccinating. They're all very, very similar to sheep. What does differ is the need for protection against cold. So I shear in March-ish. And then in September-ish to try and not shear just before that cold weather, because you really do need to provide some sort of shelter for them post-shearing, and you also need to make sure they're kidding in an environment where it's not too cold so that you get reasonable kid survival. So my goats kid in October after all that harsh weather, or hopefully after all that harsh weather has occurred. Whereas I lamb in my sheep, they lamb in July. So time of kidding does differ. Kids are far easier to mark than lambs, so no mulesing, no tail dopping. So the doe kids only need a vaccination and an e-tag, whereas the buck kids need a pain relief, castration, tag and vaccination. So very similar. In terms of infrastructure, Angora goats have lower grease content in their mohair, so you really do need a machine which has a lower speed than a typical shearing handpiece. We fortunately were just having to renew our shearing equipment for the sheep at the same time as I got into goats, so that wasn't an additional cost for us. If you had small numbers of goats, a portable electric handpiece would be fine because they have a lower speed. But other than that and the requirement for shelter, there's no real changes in infrastructure. So for shelter, I just use the standard shearing shed and shed for sheep that we have here, and I just bring them in when it's going to be, a sheep grazes alert, for example. I just make sure that they can come in here and be protected. And obviously when I kid, I make sure they're kidding around the shed. I don't actually put them in the shed. They'll seek shelter themselves, so that's not difficult. With larger numbers, I need to build some little shelters out in the paddock so I don't have to spend the time putting them in the shed. The management of them is very similar to sheep. I mean, they have to eat the same thing as the sheep because, my sheep run on pastures. So, they graze what pastures are there for the sheep. I do try to kid them on the lucerne and have the kid on the lucerne to, make sure that they grow well. But that's dependent on there being sufficient rain for the lucerne to grow over summer. And as I do with the sheep, if there's not sufficient nutrition in the pasture, they will get fed lupin grain. Particularly the kids, because they need, they've got a high protein requirement. But other than that, I obviously to minimise costs, you try not to feed them unless one has to. And so I haven't in the past couple of years had to really feed them. I don't feed hay. I don't feed hay to the sheep either, for that matter. There's sufficient roughage out in the paddock for them. And so when they're not on the lucerne, they graze, annual grass, clover sort of based pasture, or even on crop stubbles over the summer. So just exactly the same as sheep. I don't supply mineral blocks, or I haven't had to supply mineral blocks to them. If I were going to have them on oats, grazing oats, or a pasture that had no legume content in it, yes, I would probably give them some sort of calcium-based block. But I haven't had to so far. This region is not deficient in specific minerals like some other regions. Therefore, I haven't had the need to. So feeding for mohair production is probably not going to be economic. So feed them for, to maintain growth. Particularly with kids, they need to maintain growth to be healthy. So that's the key. I mean, I'm not trying to grow them up to a slaughter weight, so I don't need really high growth rates. But I do need sufficient growth rates to be healthy. My goats are very quiet relative to sheep. I don't know whether that's because of the way they were handled before I got them, or whether all goats are sort of like this, but they are much quieter than sheep, and so far, far less flighty out in the paddock, so in some ways easier to handle. To date, I've also found them easier to get into the yard, so sheep can sometimes be quite difficult to get into the yards, whereas my goats, perhaps because they come in the yards for shelter, to get into the shed in winter, have always been quite happy to come into the yards. They do fight amongst themselves a bit. That's just a goat thing. So even the does fight a little bit. Sheep do too, but not as much. So the yards and shed are exactly what I have for the sheep. I haven't done anything to the fences and whatever for the goats. So out in the paddock, a good hinge joint fence will keep them in. Do have to be mindful that one doesn't have holes in the fence or holes under the fence. So they will find those holes, as would a crossbred lamb in particular. So no, I haven't done any fencing at all for the goats. I mean, obviously, if you did intensive housing of goats, bring them in and put them in pens and look after them for a couple of days before you let them out, yes, you would probably get much better survival than you will in you would get much better survival than you will in a extensive situation. So mine is a compromise where I'll let them around the shed and they can find shelter if they want it, which probably does improve their kid survival. So last year I had 150% kids born, and I weaned 90% kids. I did have a fox predation issue last year, which about 30 kids went missing, so I need to do something about that this year. But certainly, higher percentages than 90% are possible. But again, if they were completely out in extensive situations without shelter and that, you could get quite markedly lower survival as well. I found it very difficult to find goats. Of course, I don't actually know many people with goats. I only know 2 other people with goats actually in this district. And I've never seen any when I've been driving around. So it was very hard to find them. Eventually I went and talked to Australian Mohair Marketing Organisation, and they put me onto one of their growers who sold me some goats. Originally I bought 100 does and their weaned kids, and so now I've got 120 does plus, there'd be the 90 that I weaned this year, and there's some wethers from last year as well, which is still very few, I have to say.
Yeah.